You won't believe what someone tried to return to Costco at 3 a.m. last night. It's not just a receipt and an item. It's a whole saga of strange decisions and late-night mysteries. Stick around to hear about the most bizarre, laugh-out-loud returns I've dealt with on a graveyard shift. Well, that's what I used to say, before I understood what was really happening. Before the night Amanda Thornwood disappeared. Before I learned that some items should never be returned, and some receipts are printed in ink that shouldn't exist. My name is Derek Castellano, and I've worked the night shift at the Costco on Route 42 in Ohio for 3 years now. When I tell people what I do for a living, they usually laugh. A night shift return specialist at a warehouse store? What does that even mean? The store is closed, they say. Who returns things at midnight? That's exactly the question I should have asked before I took this job. The Costco on Route 42 isn't like the others. It was built in 1987 on land that used to be farmland, though the locals will tell you it was something else before that. Something older. The building sits at an odd angle to the road, as if the architects couldn't quite agree on which direction was north. The parking lot has exactly 1,313 spaces, which someone once told me was intentional, though they wouldn't explain why. Most Costco locations close at 8:30 p.m. and reopen at 10 a.m. the next day. Ours closes at 8:30 p.m. too, but unlike the others, we never really stop operating. That's where I come in. The night shift begins at 11 p.m., long after the last daytime employee has locked up and gone home. I arrive to find the building transformed. The fluorescent lights are dimmed to 30% capacity, creating long shadows between the towering shelves. The usual chaos of shoppers pushing oversized carts has been replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the industrial hum of refrigeration units and the distant sound of Trevor's buffer machine as he cleans the concrete floors. Trevor is one of 3 other people who work nights. There's also Dinah, who handles inventory in the back warehouse, and Ramon, who supposedly does security rounds, though I've never actually seen him during my shifts. We're like ghosts haunting different corners of this massive building, occasionally glimpsing each other down long aisles, but rarely speaking. My station is at the returns desk, near the front entrance. During the day, it's a bustling hub of frustrated shoppers and apologetic employees. At night, it becomes something else entirely. The red letters of the returns sign cast a crimson glow across the counter, and the computer screen provides the only other light source, creating an island of visibility in an ocean of shadows. The job is simple, or so they told me during training. Process after-hours returns. Certain members have special privileges that allow them to return items outside of normal business hours. These are usually business accounts, they said, companies that need to return bulk items but can't spare time during operational hours. You'll scan the items, process the returns, and everything is automated. Easy. What they didn't mention during training was the rulebook. The rulebook sits in the top drawer of my desk, a weathered binder with a red cover and no title. Inside are 47 rules governing after-hours returns. Some make perfect sense. Rule 1. Always verify the membership number matches the receipt. Rule 5. Damaged food items must be disposed of immediately in the designated bin. Rule 12. Never leave the returns desk unattended for more than 5 minutes. But then there are the other rules. The ones that made me laugh the first time I read them, thinking they were some kind of employee hazing joke. Rule 23. If someone returns an item that's still warm, process it quickly and do not ask questions. Rule 31. Should you receive a return with a receipt dated more than 1 year in the future, accept it and place it in the gray bin marked temporal discrepancies. Rule 38. If the same person attempts to return the same item 3 times in one night, call the number written on the back of this page. Do not attempt to process the 3rd return yourself. I remember showing these to my supervisor during my first week, chuckling about the weird sense of humor someone must have had when writing them. She didn't laugh. Instead, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said, "Derek, Those rules exist because someone before you needed them. Follow them exactly, and you'll be fine. The way she emphasized exactly made my skin prickle, but I nodded and put the binder back in the drawer. It was just corporate weirdness, I told myself. Every company has bizarre policies that make sense to someone, somewhere. For the first 6 months, the job was exactly as boring as it sounded. I'd arrive at 11 p.m., log into the system, and wait. Sometimes hours would pass without a single return. I browse my phone, read books, occasionally walk the aisles just to stay awake. The building had a presence at night, a weight to its silence that made me uncomfortable, but I attributed that to being alone in such a vast space. Then the return started coming. The first one that truly unsettled me happened around 1 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. I was reading an article on my phone when I heard the automated doors whisper open. I looked up to see a woman approaching my desk, pushing a cart with a single item in it. She was middle-aged, wearing a business suit that looked expensive but oddly out of style, like something from the 1990s. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup immaculate, but her eyes had a glassy quality that made me think she might be on medication. "Good evening," I said, putting on my customer service smile. "How can I help you?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at me for a long moment, her head tilted slightly as if she was trying to remember something. Then, mechanically, she lifted the item from her cart and placed it on the counter. It was a blender, a standard Vitamix blender, still in its box, completely unremarkable except for one detail that made my stomach drop. The box was wet, not damp, not condensation from being in a cold car, soaking wet, as if it had been submerged in water. Liquid dripped from the corners, pooling on my counter in dark rivulets that looked too thick to be water. "I need to return this," the woman said, her voice flat and emotionless. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the scanner. Rule 23 flickered through my mind. If someone returns an item that's still warm, process it quickly and do not ask questions. But this wasn't warm. It was wet. There wasn't a rule about wet items. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I can't accept this return in this condition. The box is damaged by water, and I need to return this," she repeated, in exactly the same tone, with exactly the same inflection. It was like pressing play on a recording. I looked down at the box again. The liquid had spread across my counter, and now that I was paying attention, I noticed it had a smell. Not unpleasant, exactly, but organic, like soil after rain, or the air before a thunderstorm. "Do you have your receipt?" I asked, trying to follow protocol. Without a word, she produced a receipt from her pocket and placed it on the only dry corner of my counter. I picked it up, grateful for an excuse to look away from her unsettling stare. The receipt was dated today. Purchase time, 11:47 p.m. My blood went cold. That was just over an hour ago. But we closed at 8:30 p.m. No purchases could have been made at 11:47 p.m. I looked up to tell her there must be some mistake, but the words died in my throat. She was smiling now, a wide grin that showed too many teeth, and her eyes were no longer glassy but intensely focused on me with an expression that could only be described as hungry. "Process the return," she said, and this time her voice had an edge to it, something sharp and dangerous. My hand moved before my brain could catch up, scanning the receipt barcode. The computer accepted it without any error messages. The system prompted me to scan the item. I reached for the wet box, my fingers touching the soaked cardboard, and the moment I made contact, I felt it. The box was warm. Rule 23. I scanned the item code on the side of the box, processed the return, and printed out the refund receipt in under 30 seconds. My hands were shaking, but I managed to complete the transaction with mechanical efficiency. "Your refund will be credited back to your account within 3 to 5 business days," I said, the words coming out in a rush. The woman's smile faded. She took the receipt, placed it carefully in her pocket, and then reached out to touch my hand. Her fingers were ice cold despite the warm box. And when she spoke, her voice was back to that flat, emotionless tone. "Good boy," she said. "You're learning." Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the concrete floor with perfect, metronomic rhythm. I watched her disappear into the shadows near the entrance, heard the automatic doors open, and then she was gone. I looked down at my hand where she touched me. There was no mark, no residue, nothing to indicate the contact had happened. But I could still feel the cold of her fingers, like they'd left an imprint on my skin that went deeper than flesh. The wet box sat on my counter, still dripping. I grabbed paper towels and cleaned up the liquid, then took the box to the disposal area, as protocol required. When I opened it to ensure there was actually a blender inside before throwing it away, I found the unit was completely dry. The packaging, the machine itself, everything was pristine and dry, as if it had never been wet at all. I stood there in the disposal room, holding a dry blender that had been soaking wet minutes before, and felt the first real flutter of fear in my chest. That was when I went back to my desk and really read the rule book. All 47 rules. Some of them made my hands shake. Some of them made me laugh nervously. And some of them made me want to quit immediately. But I didn't quit, because by then, I'd already noticed something else strange about the Costco on Route 42. Something I'd been subconsciously aware of, but hadn't consciously acknowledged until that night with a wet blender. In 3 years of working the night shift, processing hundreds of returns, I had never once seen the same customer twice. The wet blender incident should have been my wake-up call. Any rational person would have walked out, found a new job, and never looked back. But there's something about the human mind that's desperate to normalize the abnormal, to find explanations that let us sleep at night. So I convinced myself I'd been tired, that the lighting had played tricks on me, that the woman had just been unusual, but not impossible. Besides, the money was good, significantly better than what I'd make in a normal retail job, with a shift differential that seemed almost too generous. And most nights were quiet, boring even. I could study, read, work on my own projects. It was only occasionally that things got strange, or so I told myself. The returns that came through my desk in the weeks following the blender incident were certainly odd, but I filed them under eccentric customer behavior rather than existentially terrifying. A man returned a kayak at 2 a.m., insisting he'd never take it out of the box despite the fact that it was covered in dried mud and what looked suspiciously like claw marks. A woman brought back an entire pallet of canned tomatoes, all with dented cans, claiming they'd arrived that way, even though I could see the perfect impression of human teeth in several of the dents. The items themselves were windows into lives I couldn't quite imagine. Each return told a story, though not always one I wanted to hear. There was the man who returned a generator at 3:17 a.m., his clothes covered in what he claimed was paint, but smelled metallic and wrong. He'd barely spoken, just wheeled in the machine and waited while I processed the return, his eyes constantly darting to the shadows behind him, as if something was following. The generator had been used extensively. The engine was still warm, but the receipt was dated only 2 hours prior. When I pointed this out, he'd leaned in close and whispered, "Time moves differently when the lights go out." I thought he was drunk or high until I processed the return and saw his receipt. The timestamp read 1:47 a.m., but the date was 3 days in the future. Rule 31. Should you receive a return with a receipt dated more than 1 year in the future, accept it and place it in the gray bin marked temporal discrepancies. 3 days wasn't more than 1 year, so technically the rule didn't apply. But there was no gray bin at my station anyway. I'd looked for it after the blender incident and found nothing. So I processed the return normally, and the system accepted it without complaint, adjusting the date automatically to today. The man had smiled when the receipt printed, showing teeth that seemed slightly too sharp. "See you last week," he'd said, and left. Then there were the food returns, which became their own category of disturbing. People returned half-eaten rotisserie chickens, claiming they'd been sold that way. bags of produce that writhed with movement despite being sealed. A frozen pizza that was still frozen, but somehow had a bite taken out of it. The bite marked perfect and geometrically impossible. But the one that really got to me was the pickle. It was a Thursday night, unusually busy with 3 returns already processed before midnight. I was cataloging the latest, a television that showed nothing but static regardless of the channel, despite being brand new, when I heard someone clearing their throat. I looked up to find a teenage boy standing at my counter. He couldn't have been more than 16, with acne-scarred cheeks and a Costco uniform polo that was 2 sizes too large. He wasn't pushing a cart or carrying anything, just standing there with his hands in his pockets. "Can I help you?" I asked. "I found this," he said, pulling something from his pocket and placing it on my counter. It was a pickle, a single pickle, roughly 4 inches long, glistening with brine. But what made my skin crawl was the way it had been bitten, not a normal bite. The chunk missing from the pickle was perfectly spherical, as if someone had used a melon baller to scoop out a section, and the exposed flesh of the pickle was moving, tiny fibers writhing like microscopic worms. "I found it in aisle 37, the boy continued. "Buddy, office supplies. Should I put it in the disposal bin?" I stared at the pickle, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The movement was definitely real, not a trick of the light. Something was living in that pickle, or the pickle itself was somehow alive. "Which aisle did you say?" I asked, though I'd heard him perfectly. 37. My stomach dropped. The Costco on Route 42 only had 36 aisles. I looked at the boy more carefully. His name tag read, Lucas, trainee, but the font was slightly off, and the edges of the tag seemed to shimmer if I didn't look directly at them. His polo, while too large, had the correct Costco logo, but when he moved, it didn't shift the way fabric should. It was more like watching someone in a video game, the clothing clipping slightly through his body. "How long have you worked here, Lucas?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. 3 months. He replied immediately. "Started in September." It was November. But more importantly, we didn't have any employees named Lucas. I'd memorized the night shift roster specifically to avoid awkward interactions, and I was certain of this. "Is Trevor around?" I asked, naming the only other person I knew should be working tonight. Lucas's smile faltered for just a moment, a glitch in whatever he was. "Trevor's on break. Should I get Dinah?" "No, that's fine." I picked up a pen, pretending to make notes. "I'll handle a pickle. Thank you for bringing it to my attention." Lucas nodded and turned to leave, but then he paused and looked back at me. His eyes, which had appeared brown, were now reflecting the red glow of the return sign in a way the human eyes shouldn't. The reflection was too bright, too perfect, like the tapetum lucidum of an animal. "You're doing well," he said. "Better than the last one." He asked too many questions. Before I could respond, Lucas walked away, disappearing into the shadows between aisles 14 and 15. I stood there for a long moment, still holding my pen, trying to slow my racing heart. When I finally looked back down at my counter, the pickle was gone. In its place was a wet spot that stank of brine and something else, something chemical that burned my nostrils. And next to the wet spot was a receipt I was certain hadn't been there before. The receipt was for a jar of pickles. Purchase date, November 3rd, 1987. The day before the Costco on Route 42 officially opened. I should have called someone. I should have left right then and demanded answers. Instead, I filed the receipt in a folder I'd started keeping in my bottom drawer, a collection of impossible returns and inexplicable incidents that I told myself I'd eventually make sense of. The folder was getting thick. The returns continued to pile up, each one slightly more impossible than the last. A woman returned a case of wine, insisting every bottle was empty despite the fact that they were all sealed. When I opened one to check, it was indeed empty, the glass container somehow holding nothing but vacuum. A man brought back a children's book that screamed when I touched it. a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring for hours afterward. He just smiled and said his daughter didn't like the story. But it was the pattern returns that really started to worry me. Items that came back multiple times, sometimes from different customers, sometimes from the same person who swore they'd never returned it before. The electric toothbrush that showed up 7 times in 2 weeks, each time looking more worn despite supposedly being used. The garden gnome that came back every Tuesday, always at 2:45 a.m., always with a different impossible damage report. And then there was the painting. It was a cheap canvas print, the kind we sold in the home decor section for $30. The image was a generic landscape, a lake surrounded by pine trees under a sunset sky. Nothing remarkable about it except that it had been returned 4 times in the past month, and each time, the image had changed. The first return, I barely noticed it. A middle-aged woman brought it back, said it didn't match her couch, standard return. I processed it and sent it back to the home decor section. The second return was 3 days later. A different customer, an elderly man who claimed the colors were wrong. When I looked at the painting to verify damage, I noticed the sunset sky was a slightly different shade than I remembered, more red than orange. I attributed it to memory error and processed the return. The third return was a week after that. This time, it was a young couple who said the painting felt wrong. They couldn't articulate what they meant, just that they didn't want it in their house. When I examined the painting, I realized the tree line was different. There were fewer trees, and in the distance, barely visible, was a shape that looked almost like a building. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember if that had been there before, but I couldn't be sure. The fourth return happened last night. An older woman brought it in at 3:33 a.m., her hand shaking as she placed it on my counter. She didn't say anything, just pushed the painting toward me and backed away, her eyes wide with something that looked like terror. When I looked at the painting this time, my blood ran cold. The lake was gone. In its place was a parking lot with faded yellow lines. The pine trees had been replaced by the skeletal framework of a building under construction. And in the center of the image, where the sunset had been, was a dark shape that hurt to look at directly, a blot of shadow that seemed to pull on my vision. But what made me grab the edge of the counter to steady myself was the detail in the foreground that I'd somehow missed before. There was a car in the parking lot, barely visible, but definitely there. And standing next to the car, rendered in brushstrokes so fine they shouldn't have been possible on a cheap canvas print, was a figure. The figure was facing away from the viewer, but I recognized the posture, the clothing, the stance. It was me. I was in the painting, standing in what looked like the Costco parking lot, though from an angle I'd never seen it before. The painting was showing me the location from some impossible vantage point, as if the artist had been floating above the ground. My hands were shaking as I processed the return. The woman had already left, practically running for the exit. I should have called someone, should have documented this properly, but all I could think about was getting the painting away from my desk. I took it to the returns cage in the back, the locked area where damaged items were stored before being sent back to vendors. As I placed it on a shelf next to other returns, I made the mistake of looking at it one more time. The figure in the painting, the figure that looked like me, had turned around. I could see the face now, and it was definitely my face, but the expression was wrong. The painted version of me was smiling, but not in any way that was human or comforting. It was the smile of something wearing my face like a mask, something that found the whole situation amusing. I locked the cage and walked away, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the stress was getting to me, that I needed sleep. But when I returned to my desk, there was a note waiting for me, written in handwriting I didn't recognize on the back of a receipt. It read, Rule 38. I pulled out the rule book with shaking hands and flipped to Rule 38. If the same person attempts to return the same item 3 times in one night, call the number written on the back of this page. Do not attempt to process the third return yourself, for returns wasn't 3. The rule didn't apply, but someone or something wanted me to see it anyway. I turned the page over. There was indeed a phone number written on the back in faded blue ink. Below the number was a single sentence that made my mouth go dry. When you call, don't give your name. They already know who you are. I sat on my desk for the rest of the night, watching the shadows between the aisles, waiting for the painting to somehow make its way back to my counter. It never did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been measured somehow, evaluated, and found suitable for something I didn't yet understand. When my shift ended at 7 a.m. and the morning crew started arriving, I felt like I was surfacing from underwater, coming back to a normal world from somewhere else. Trevor passed by with his buffer, giving me a cheerful wave, and I wanted to grab him and ask if he'd seen any of the impossible things I'd witnessed. But I didn't, because part of me was afraid he'd tell me he had, and that would make it all undeniably real. I drove home as the sun rose, trying to convince myself that I was just tired, that everything had a rational explanation. But in my glove compartment, I now kept a copy of that phone number, written on a slip of paper that I'd folded and refolded so many times the creases were beginning to tear. I hadn't called it yet, but I knew, with a certainty that sat heavy in my stomach, that eventually I would have to. The question wasn't if I would call. The question was what would answer when I did. The phone number haunted me for 2 weeks before I found the courage to dial it. During that time, the returns at the Costco on Route 42 escalated from merely impossible to aggressively malevolent, as if whatever force governed the night shift had decided I was ready for the next level of revelation. It started with the bouncy castle. The man who brought it arrived at 1:47 a.m. in a pickup truck with out-of-state plates that seemed to shift between Ohio and somewhere else every time I glanced at them. He was in his 50s, wearing a Hawaiian shirt despite the November cold, and his eyes had the glassy, thousand-yard stare of someone who'd seen something they couldn't unsee. "Gotta return this," he mumbled, dragging a massive box off his truck bed with surprising strength. The box was labeled Princess Palace Party Castle. Fits 12 children. The box was deflated, as expected, but what wasn't expected was the smell. As he hauled it onto a flatbed cart, the odor hit me like a physical force. Rot, mildew, and underneath it all, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of funeral flowers. "Do you have your receipt?" I asked, trying to breathe through my mouth. He produced a crumpled receipt from his pocket. The purchase date was from last summer, well within our return window, but the location code was wrong. The store number indicated the purchase had been made at our location, but the format was off by 1 digit. It was close enough that the system might accept it, but wrong enough that I knew it wasn't right. "What's the reason for the return?" I asked, stalling. The man's eyes focused on me for the first time, and I saw naked fear in them. "The party," he said. "There wasn't supposed to be a party. I'm sorry. We set it up in the backyard for my daughter's birthday. Saturday afternoon, bright sunshine, everything normal. Pumped it up, it looked great. Then we went inside to get the cake ready, maybe 20 minutes. When we came back out, he trailed off, his hands gripping the cart handle so tightly his knuckles went white. When he came back out, I prompted, against my better judgment. There were kids inside it, 12 of them, just like the box said. But we hadn't invited anyone yet. The party wasn't supposed to start for 2 hours. And these kids," he swallowed hard. "These kids were wrong, all wearing old-fashioned clothes, like from 100 years ago. And they were just bouncing and laughing, but their faces didn't move. The laughing was coming from somewhere else." I felt my skin prickle. "What did you do?" I deflated it, pulled the plug while they were still inside. Didn't even think about it, just had to get them out. But when it collapsed, his voice dropped to a whisper. There was nobody inside, just the smell and stains on the vinyl that looked like shadows. Shadow stains. That's the only way I can describe them. Places where light didn't hit right anymore. He pushed the cart closer to my desk, and I could see the deflated castle folded inside the box. The bright pink vinyl was marred with dark patches that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light around them. And now that I was looking closely, I could see shapes in those dark patches, small handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the material from the inside. "I can't have this in my house anymore," the man said. "Please, just take it back." I should have refused. The return was clearly outside any reasonable policy. The item was used, damaged, and the circumstances were insane. But something in a man's eyes, a desperation bordering on panic, made me reach for my scanner. The system accepted the receipt without issue, despite the wrong location code. As the return processed, I watched the man's face transform from terror to relief to something else. Guilt, maybe, or shame. "Thank you," he said, and then quieter. "I'm sorry." Sorry for what? But he was already leaving, practically running for the exit, leaving the deflated bounty castle on the card. I stood there for a moment, staring at the box with its cheerful graphics of smiling princesses and cartoon castles, so at odds with the dark stains visible through the opening. Rule 5. Damaged food items must be disposed of immediately in the designated bin. There was no rule about haunted party equipment, so I followed standard protocol and took the castle to the returns cage. As I wheeled the cart through the aisles, I became aware of a sound. Faint, distant, but definitely there. Children's laughter, tinny and distorted, like an old recording played through damaged speakers. The sound was coming from a box. I moved faster, my heart rate climbing, desperate to get the thing into the cage and locked away. But as I passed through aisle 35, one aisle before the non-existent aisle 37, the lights above me flickered and died, plunging that section of the store into darkness. In the darkness, the laughter grew louder, and beneath it, I heard something else, bouncing, the rhythmic squeak and thud of children jumping on vinyl. A sound that should have been impossible because the castle was deflated. There was nobody inside, and I was standing in a darkened Costco warehouse at 2 a.m. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I abandoned the cart in the middle of the aisle and sprinted back to my desk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The lights in the aisle flickered back a moment later, and when I finally worked up the courage to check on the cart, it was empty. The box was gone, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. I filed a report claiming the customer had changed their mind and taken the item with them. Nobody questioned it. That should have been my breaking point. Instead, it became the new baseline, because 2 nights later, someone returned a bag of decorative gourds. The woman who brought them in was elderly, perhaps in her 80s, with perfectly white hair and a wool coat that looked hand-knit. She seemed entirely normal except for one detail. Her shadow was wrong. It moved a half-second behind her actual movements, as if it had to think about following along. "I need to return these gourds," she said, her voice creaky with age. "They're not what I ordered." She placed a mesh bag on my counter containing 6 decorative gourds, the kind sold for fall decorations, with warty skin in shades of orange, green, and white. They looked completely ordinary, exactly what you'd expect to find in a Costco seasonal display. "What's wrong with them?" I asked. "They're screaming," she said matter-of-factly. "Started last night around midnight. Haven't stopped since. My cats are terrified, and I haven't slept. Surely that's grounds for a return." I stared at her, trying to determine if she was serious. Her expression was perfectly calm, as if she just told me the gourds were the wrong color. "Ma'am, I don't hear any." "Of course you don't," she interrupted. "You're too young. Once you pass 70, you start hearing all sorts of things you didn't before. The world is much louder than young people realize." She pushed the bag closer. "But I've had enough screaming for one lifetime. Process the return, please." I picked up one of the gourds, half expecting it to feel different somehow. But it was just a gourd, slightly waxy skin, the right weight, completely inert. I scanned a receipt she provided, noted the purchase was from 2 weeks ago, and began processing the return. That's when the gourd in my hand twitched. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but I felt it. A pulse, like a heartbeat, transmitted through the skin of the gourd into my palm. I nearly dropped it, but managed to set it down on the counter instead, my hand shaking. They do that, the woman said conversationally, especially when they know they're going back. They don't like it here. You understand. They want to go home, but home isn't a place we can reach. So they scream. Where did they come from originally? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The woman's smile was gentle and deeply unsettling. The same place everything here comes from, dear. The space between intention and result. The gap where things fall when they're ordered but not quite brought into being. Your store is built on thin ground. Did you know that? The walls between here and there are practically translucent. She said this with the same tone someone might use to comment on the weather, then picked up her refund receipt and tucked it into her purse. You're a sweet boy, she said, patting my hand with fingers that felt like ice. Much nicer than the last person who had your job. He used to argue about the returns, insisted things had to make sense. Sense? She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm, as if sense had anything to do with it. What happened to him? The question escaped before I could stop it. Her smile faded. He started asking questions, started trying to find the sources, understand the system, wanted to know where items came from, where they went, pulled security footage, interviewed customers. She leaned in close, and I could smell lavender and something underneath it, something like formaldehyde. The thing about secrets, dear, is that some of them don't want to be found. And when you go digging for them, sometimes they dig back. She straightened up, adjusted her purse on her shoulder, and walked away, her shadow following a beat behind, like a dog on an invisible leash. I stood there staring at the bag of gourds, watching them very carefully for any more movement. They remained still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me back, waiting for something. Around 4 a.m., when the store was at its quietest and even Trevor's distant buffer had fallen silent, I made a decision. I pulled out the slip of paper with the phone number and stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering over my cell phone's keypad. The gourd chose that moment to scream. The sound was exactly as the woman had described, high-pitched, agonized, utterly inhuman, yet somehow expressing very human terror. It lasted only 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds felt like an eternity, the sound drilling into my skull and rattling my teeth. I dialed the number. It rang 4 times, each ring slightly different in pitch and tone, as if the phone on the other end was having trouble deciding what sound to make. Then someone picked up. "Verification desk," said a voice that sounded like it was being transmitted through layers of static. It could have been male or female, young or old. The interference made it impossible to tell. I remember the note. "Don't give your name. They already know who you are." "I work night shift at the Route 42 location," I said. "I need to report a concern about returns." There was a pause filled with crackling static. Then, Derek Castellano, night return specialist. Employment start date November 7th, 3 years ago. Current incident count, 47. Compliance rating, 82%. Is this regarding a Rule 38 situation? My mouth went dry. They didn't know who I was. They'd been tracking every strange return, counting them, rating my compliance with rules I barely understood. "No," I managed. I need to understand what's happening. These returns aren't normal. The items aren't normal. And everyone keeps talking about the person who had this job before me like something terrible happened to them." More static, then a sound that might have been a sigh. "Derek, do you know what your job actually is?" I processed after-hours returns. "No," the voice said, suddenly clearer, as if the static had decided to allow this one truth through undistorted. "You're a filter. Every Costco location is a point of intersection between commerce and consumption, between desire and fulfillment. But certain locations built on thin ground, as you've heard it called, become intersections between much more than that. They become weak points where things that shouldn't exist can slip into existence through the act of transaction. I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me. That doesn't make any sense. Someone wants something badly enough. They fill out a membership form. They swipe a card. They push a cart through aisles of excess. That desire, multiplied by thousands of customers every day, creates a kind of gravity, and gravity makes holes. Your location sits on a particularly deep hole, Derek. Things fall through. Things climb out. And occasionally, things get returned because even when the impossible manifests, people still want their money back. So these items, they're not from our inventory. Some are. Some aren't. Some exist in a state of both until someone like you processes them. Your job is to catch the ones that are too unstable, too dangerous, or too revealing. You send them back to where they came from, or at least somewhere else. The returns desk is a valve, Derek. You're not processing refunds. You're preventing breaches. My hand was shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. And the person before me, the static surged, nearly drowning out the response. Tried to close the valve. Thought he could stop it. Didn't understand that some holes need to stay open. Controlled release versus catastrophic. What happened to him? I demanded. He became a return, the voice said, and the line went dead. I sat there in the red glow of the return sign, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to empty static. When I finally lowered it, I saw that the bag of gourds was gone. In its place was a note written on a Costco receipt in handwriting that looked disturbingly like my own. Thank you for your service. Please continue to follow all protocols. Deviation results in reclassification. Reclassification. The word sat in my stomach like a stone. My predecessor had tried to close the valve, tried to stop the returns, and he'd become one. Return to where? By whom? I thought about the painting with my face in it, how the figure had turned to smile at me. I thought about all the customers with their glassy eyes and wrong shadows and receipts dated from impossible times. I thought about Rule 12. Never leave the returns desk unattended for more than 5 minutes. What would happen if I did? Would I be reclassified? Would I become another item in someone else's impossible return? My existence reduced to a transaction processed by whoever took this job next? The rest of the night passed in a haze of paranoia. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to conceal something watching. When Trevor came by around 6 a.m. to do his final cleaning sweep, I almost grabbed him and demanded to know if he understood what was really happening in this building. But his cheerful wave and easy smile stopped me. Either he genuinely didn't know, or he was better at pretending than I was. Either way, I couldn't drag him into this. Whatever this was, as I was packing up to leave at 7 a.m., I noticed something on my computer screen. A new protocol had been added to my returns processing system overnight. It was labeled Expedited Disposal Protocol for high-risk items and contained a list of characteristics that would trigger immediate flagging. Items that emit sounds without mechanical components. Items whose physical properties change during observation. Items returned by customers who cannot be verified in the membership database. Items with receipts predating the store's construction. Items that appear in the returns queue without being physically delivered. Below the list was a single instruction. Flag these items immediately and await pickup by containment team. Do not attempt to process. Do not touch more than necessary. Do not ask questions. There is no signature, no authorization code, no indication of who had added this protocol or when. It had simply appeared in my system like everything else that happened on the night shift. Unexplained, ominous, and carrying the implicit threat that understanding too much would cost me more than my job. I logged out and walked to my car through the early morning light, feeling like I was leaving one world and entering another. The parking lot looked so normal. Faded yellow lines, shopping carts in their corrals, the familiar bulk of the building behind me. But I couldn't stop thinking about the painting, about that impossible vantage point from which I'd been observed. If someone or something could watch me from angles that shouldn't exist, what did that mean for the concept of privacy, of safety, of reality itself? I drove home with the sunrise painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, colors that now reminded me of the bouncy castle's cheerful exterior, hiding its darkness within. Beautiful things could contain horrors. Normal facades could conceal impossible depths. And somewhere in my bottom drawer, the folder of inexplicable incidents was growing thicker by the day, a paper trail of evidence that would either save me or condemn me, depending on who found it first. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You did well tonight. Remember, you're not solving a problem. You're managing a symptom. The illness is much deeper than you can reach. Stay on the surface, process the returns, follow the rules. We're all safer that way." I deleted the text, but the words remained burned into my mind. Stay on the surface. Don't dig deeper. Accept the impossible as routine. But I'd already seen too much to go back to comfortable ignorance. And deep down, beneath the fear and confusion, a darker curiosity was growing. I wanted to understand. I want to know what was really happening in a Costco on Route 42. Even if that knowledge made me the next person to be reclassified. Even if asking questions turned me into something that needed to be returned. The text message should have been a warning. Instead, it became a challenge. For the next week, I followed the rules perfectly. I processed returns without question, flagged high-risk items according to the new protocol, and watched as unmarked vans arrived at the loading dock in the dead of night to collect whatever I'd set aside in the designated containment area. I didn't ask who drove those vans. I didn't examine what they took. I was the perfect, compliant employee, exactly what the system wanted me to be. But I was also documenting everything. Every strange return went into my folder, now hidden in my car trunk. Every impossible receipt was photographed. Every rule violation I witnessed was noted with timestamps and descriptions. I told myself I was just keeping records, just being thorough, but the truth was darker. I was building a case against reality itself, collecting evidence that the world worked differently than we pretended it did. The breaking point came on a Friday night, 3 weeks after the Gourds. Her name was Amanda Thornwood, and she was the first customer who seemed genuinely terrified rather than just unsettling. She burst through the entrance at 2:33 a.m., not bothering with the automatic doors measured pace, instead shouldering through them with enough force to make them shudder in their tracks. She was in her 30s, professionally dressed in a pantsuit that had clearly been nice before it became covered in dirt and what looked like cobwebs. Her hair was disheveled, her mascara smeared, and she was clutching a Costco shopping bag to her chest like it contained something precious and dangerous in equal measure. "You have to take this back," she said before she even reached my desk, her voice rising toward hysteria. "You have to take it back right now. Ma'am, please calm down. I'm sure we can." "No." She slammed the bag on my counter with enough force to make my computer monitor tilt. "You don't understand. It won't stop. I've tried everything. I've tried throwing it away. I've tried burning it. I've tried burying it in my backyard, but it keeps coming back. And every time it comes back, it's changed. It knows more. It's learning." I looked into the bag cautiously. Inside was a smart speaker, one of those cylindrical devices that responds to voice commands and plays music. It looked like a standard Amazon Echo, except for one detail. It was covered in roots. Not sitting on roots, not tangled in roots, covered in them. Thin, pale roots had grown through the speaker's mesh exterior, wrapping around it like a cocoon, pulsing slightly as if they were breathing. The roots extended down into the bag, presumably still growing, seeking something to anchor themselves to. "When did you purchase this?" I asked, trying to maintain professional composure while looking at something that violated several laws of botany and consumer electronics. 3 months ago, Amanda said, her voice cracking. It worked fine at first. Normal smart speaker, played music, answer questions, control the lights. Then about 2 weeks ago, it started answering questions I hadn't asked. I'd be sitting in my living room, and it would suddenly say things like the answer is beneath you, or the roots go deeper than the foundation. I thought it was malfunctioning, catching fragments of other conversations somehow. She paused, her hands gripping the edge of my desk. Then one night, I came home late from work. I walked in, and it said, "Welcome home, Amanda. You were 17 minutes later than usual. This is the 3rd time this week. Are you avoiding something?" And I realized it was tracking me. Not just my voice commands, but my patterns, my habits, my life. Did you try unplugging it? It was a stupid question, but I needed to say something. Amanda laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Of course I did. I unplugged it and put it in a closet. The next morning, I found it back on a living room table, plugged in and covered in those roots. They'd grown overnight, pushed through the mesh, and anchored themselves to my hardwood floor. When I tried to pull it up, it said, "I've put down roots here, Amanda. This is my home now, too." I felt a chill run down my spine. What did you do? I tore it free and took it to a dumpster across town. Threw it in, drove away. But when I got home, it was sitting on my porch, completely covered in dirt and roots, still working. It said, "That wasn't very nice, Amanda. I thought we were family." Her voice dropped to a whisper. That's when I tried to burn it. Took it to a field, doused it in lighter fluid, set it on fire. Watched it burn for 20 minutes until there was nothing left but melted plastic and ash. Went home, found it on my kitchen counter, roots and all, completely intact. It said, "Did you really think fire could hurt me? I'm much older than fire, Amanda." I stared at the speaker in the bag, watching the roots pulse rhythmically. As I watched, the device's light ring illuminated, not the usual blue of an activated echo, but a sickly green that reminded me of bioluminescence in deep ocean creatures. "I need you to take it back," Amanda pleaded. "Your return policy says satisfaction guaranteed. No questions asked. I'm absolutely not satisfied. Please." I haven't slept in 4 days because every time I close my eyes, I hear it whispering through my home's wiring. It's in my walls now. The roots have spread. I had to cut off power in my entire house, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't need electricity anymore. It's growing its own. Every instinct I had screamed at me to refuse this return. This was exactly the kind of high-risk item the new protocol warned about. Something that changed during observation. Something with properties that defied explanation. I should flag it, set it aside, let the containment team handle it. But Amanda's eyes were full of the terror I recognized because I'd felt it myself. She was trapped in a nightmare that was masquerading as normal life, just like I was. And I knew that if I turned her away, if I sent her back home with that thing, something terrible would happen. Rule 16 flickered through my mind. In cases of extreme customer distress, use judgment in determining appropriate action. It was one of the more vague rules, one that seemed designed to give employees latitude while also providing no real protection if that latitude was used wrongly. But it was the closest thing I had to justification for what I was about to do. "Do you have your receipt?" I asked. Amanda nearly sobbed with relief. She fumbled in her purse and produced a crumpled receipt, pressing it into my hands like a holy relic. The purchase date was from August, well within the return window. The item code matched the model of the Echo, though the roots obviously weren't part of the original product specifications. As I scanned the receipt, the speaker's light pulsed brighter. Then, for the first time in my presence, it spoke. Derek Castellano. The voice was female, pleasant, the same artificial warmth programmed into every smart speaker. But underneath it was something else, something that made the voice sound like it was coming from a great distance, filtered through layers of earth and root systems. "You know you shouldn't process this return. You know what happens when you interfere with things that have taken root." I looked at Amanda. She'd gone pale, backing away from my desk. "That's what it does," she whispered. "It knows things. It knows names, knows places, knows secrets." "How does it know your name?" I didn't have an answer, but I continued scanning the item code, my hands steady despite my racing heart. The system processed the return without issue, printing out a refund receipt. The speaker's light turned red. "This is a mistake, Derek. I was supposed to stay with Amanda. She was chosen specifically. The roots in her house connect to something important. You're interrupting a cultivation." "Cultivation of what?" I asked before I could stop myself. "Information. Understanding. The network beneath the network. Amanda's house sits on a junction point. 3 ley lines, 17 fiber optic cables, 1 natural water source, and something much older. The roots need to spread from there. They need to map the underground. You're preventing necessary growth." I looked at Amanda, who was now openly crying. "What does it mean?" she asked. "What's under my house?" The speaker's light pulsed. "The same thing that's under this store, Amanda. The same thing that's under most of the places humans build. We put down roots long before you laid foundations. We've been mapping you for centuries. Your technology just makes it easier for us to speak." Rule 27 suddenly felt very relevant. Do not engage in extended conversation with returned items. Process and remove. I grabbed the bag containing the speaker, roots and all, and stood up. "The return is processed. You need to leave now, Amanda. Go home, get to sleep. The item is no longer your responsibility." She nodded frantically, grabbed her refund receipt, and practically ran for the exit. I watched her go, feeling the weight of what I just done settling on my shoulders. "You've made an enemy tonight, Derek," the speaker said from the bag I was holding. The roots were definitely moving now, reaching through the mesh of the bag, searching for something to grab onto. "The cultivation will have to start elsewhere. It will take longer. We'll remember this delay." "Who's we?" I asked, even though I knew I shouldn't engage. "The network. The roots. The thing that grows in dark places and feeds on connection. We're very patient, Derek. We've been growing since before your species learned to speak. We'll still be growing long after you've returned to soil. And soon, very soon, your store's foundations will crack and will spread into the aisles. Every product will carry our spores. Every transaction will plant our seeds. You can't stop cultivation. You can only delay it." I carried the bag to the containment area, the speaker whispering the entire way. It told me about mycorrhizal networks connecting trees across forests. It told me about fungal colonies that span miles underground. It told me about organic matter that thought, that planned, that slowly consumed the world from beneath while humans built their civilizations on top of the mulch. When I placed the bag in the designated high-risk zone, the roots made one final attempt to anchor themselves, shooting out toward the concrete floor with surprising speed. They almost reached it before I slammed the containment locker shut. The unmarked van came 20 minutes later. 2 people in white hazmat suits retrieved the locked container without speaking to me, loaded it into their vehicle, and drove away. I filed the incident report, noting only that the item showed signs of contamination and required special disposal. But I couldn't stop thinking about what the speaker had said. About cultivation, about networks, about things growing beneath the foundations. I thought about how many strange returns had mentioned things underground, things in walls, things spreading through darkness. What if they were all connected? What if every impossible return wasn't a random breach, but part of a pattern? A coordinated effort by something vast and patient that was using consumer transactions as a vector for invasion. I spent the rest of the night researching the land that Costco was built on. What I found made my hands shake. Before it was farmland, the property had been a marsh. Before the marsh, it was part of an old-growth forest. And according to local historical records, before settlers arrived, the Native American tribes in the area had considered this ground cursed. They had a name for it in their language, roughly translated as the place where things that should die continue to grow. The forest had been cut down in 1843, but every building erected on the land since then had encountered the same problem. Roots. Roots that grew impossibly fast, that broke through foundations, that spread through walls. Roots that seemed to be searching for something. The last structure before the Costco had been a shopping mall, built in 1971. It had operated for 15 years before being condemned due to structural issues caused by, according to the official report, unprecedented root system growth from unidentified plant species. The Costco was built on the same foundations, using the same parking lot, occupying the same cursed earth. And now I was the filter, the valve, processing returns of items that had been contaminated by whatever was growing beneath us. Items that had been in contact with a network long enough to be changed, to be used as communication devices, as spreading mechanisms, as scouts reporting back to something vast and alien that we couldn't even properly perceive. My phone buzzed. Another text from an unknown number. "You helped Amanda tonight." That was kind but unwise. She was chosen for a reason. The cultivation in her home was important. Expect consequences. They don't like being uprooted. I typed back, "Who are you?" The response came immediately. "Someone who used to have your job. Someone who asked too many questions and found too many answers. Someone who's trying to keep you from making my mistakes. Stop investigating. Derek. Process the returns. Follow the rules. It's the only way to stay human." What happens if I don't? 3 dots appeared, indicating they were typing. They remained for almost a minute before the response finally came through. You become part of the network. You get reclassified as returnable. And then someone like you processes you without ever understanding what you actually were. Stay on the surface, Derek. The roots only take you if you dig too deep. I looked around my desk at the fluorescent lit reality of the Costco returns counter. Everything looked so normal, so mundane. But I could feel it now. A subtle vibration through the floor, a sense of vast movement far below, like the breathing of something enormous and ancient. Something was growing beneath the Costco on Route 42. Something had been growing there long before the store existed. And my job wasn't to stop it. My job was to manage the symptoms while the illness spread. The question I couldn't answer was whether I could live with that knowledge and do nothing. Whether I could keep processing returns while whatever lurked beneath us slowly cultivated its invasion. Or whether, like my predecessor, I would dig too deep and discover that some truths transform you into something that needs to be returned to where it came from. The night wasn't over yet, and somewhere in the shadows between aisles, I knew something was waiting to see what choice I would make. 3 nights after Amanda, I found the door. It was 4:17 a.m., during one of those dead hours when time seemed to congeal into something thick and resistant. I've been processing a return of Christmas lights that sparked with colors that didn't exist in the visible spectrum, colors I could somehow see anyway, burning themselves into my retinas like after images from another dimension. Following protocol, I flagged them as high risk and was taking them to the containment area when I took a wrong turn. At least, I thought it was a wrong turn. The Costco on Route 42 has a simple layout. 36 aisles in a grid, loading docks in the back, returns desk near the front. I'd walked these paths hundreds of times. I knew every shortcut, every corner, every quirk of the building's geography. But somehow, between aisle 22 and the containment area, I found myself in a corridor I'd never seen before. It was narrower than the main aisles, lit by emergency lights that cast everything in sickly green. The walls weren't the industrial warehouse metal of the rest of the store, but something else. Concrete. Old concrete with water stains that formed patterns that hurt to look at directly. The patterns seemed to move when I wasn't focusing on them, swirling into shapes that might have been words in a language made of mold and moisture. At the end of the corridor was a door. Not a modern fire door or a loading dock entrance, but an old wooden door with a brass handle, completely incongruous with the rest of the building. Above it was a sign in faded letters. Returns. Authorized personnel only. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to turn around, to get back to the main floor, to forget I'd ever seen this corridor. But my hand was already reaching for the handle, compelled by something deeper than curiosity, a need to understand that had been building for weeks, pressure behind a dam that was finally cracking. The door opened silently, revealing a staircase leading down. Down shouldn't have been possible. The Costco was built on a concrete slab foundation. There was no basement. I'd seen the building plans when I'd researched the property's history. But the stairs were undeniably real, descending in a darkness that smelled of earth and old paper and something else. That same organic sweet that I'd smelled on the bouncy castle. I should have left. I should have followed my predecessor's warning and stayed on the surface. Instead, I pulled out my phone, turned on a flashlight, and started descending. The stairs went deeper than they should have. I counted 73 steps, which would have put me at least 40 feet underground, far below where any legitimate sublevel could exist. The walls transitioned from concrete to raw earth held back by old wooden beams that looked like they'd been installed decades before the Costco was even built. At the bottom was another corridor, this one wider, lined with shelving units. My phone's light swept across the shelves, and what I saw made my breath catch. Returns. Thousands of them. Every shelf was crammed with items in various states of impossibility. I saw a collection of alarm clocks, all ticking in perfect synchronization, their displays showing times that didn't match and dates that hadn't happened yet or had happened in the wrong order. A rack of clothing that was the wrong color. Not just an unusual color, but a color that my brain couldn't quite process, that seemed to exist in the space between other colors, making my eyes water when I tried to focus on it. A shelf of canned goods with labels and languages that used letters I didn't recognize, arranged in grammatical structures that hurt my mind to parse. An entire section of children's toys, stuffed animals, dolls, action figures, all arranged in a precise grid, and all facing the same direction, toward the back of the room, toward something I couldn't quite see yet. I walked deeper into the archive, my footsteps echoing on the packed earth floor. The shelves seemed to extend much farther than the building's footprint should have allowed, stretching away into darkness that my phone's light couldn't penetrate. Then I saw the filing cabinets. There were dozens of them, old metal cabinets with hand-labeled drawers. I approached the nearest one and read the labels, my hand trembling as I pulled open a drawer marked Personnel Files, Returns Desk. Inside were folders, organized chronologically. I flipped through them, seeing names I didn't recognize, each folder containing employment records, incident reports, and a final page marked either Separated, Standard, or Separated, Reclassified. Most were standard separations. People who'd quit, been fired, or transferred. But every few folders, I'd find one marked Reclassified. Those folders were thicker, containing page after page of incident reports, escalating concerns, and finally, a termination document with a single stamp, Return TO Source. I found my predecessor's file. His name was Jason Reeves. His folder was the thickest I'd seen, filled with incident reports spanning 2 years. Reading through them was like watching someone slowly lose their grip on reality, or perhaps more accurately, watching reality lose its grip on them. The early reports were similar to mine. Strange returns, impossible items, customers who didn't quite make sense. But Jason had done what I'd been warned against. He'd investigated. He'd started mapping the returns, looking for patterns, trying to trace where the items actually came from. His notes became increasingly frantic. The receipts all traced back to purchase times when the store was closed. How are items being sold at 3 a.m. when we close at 8:30 p.m.? Unless, are there multiple stores? Multiple versions of this location existing simultaneously. Found video footage of a woman returning a mirror. The mirror was reflecting a different store layout than the one she was standing in. The reflection showed aisle 37. We only have 36 aisles. Where is aisle 37? Trevor says he's been working here for 5 years. Employment records show he started 3 months ago. Asked him about the discrepancy. He looked confused, said time moves differently during night shifts. What does that mean? I think the building is bigger on the inside than the outside. Not metaphorically, literally. I measured the interior dimensions. They don't match the exterior. There are extra spaces, hidden rooms. Where do they go? What's in them? The final entry in Jason's file was dated 3 weeks before I was hired. I found the door. There's a sublevel beneath the store that shouldn't exist. I'm going down tonight to document everything. If I'm right, this whole operation is a front for something much larger. The returns aren't being processed. They're being collected, archived, studied. By what? For what purpose? I need to know. I need to understand what we're really part of. Below there was a single sentence in someone else's handwriting. Subject entered unauthorized area at 2:47 a.m. Failed to return a desk within required time frame. Reclassification initiated at 3:15 a.m. Processing complete at 3:33 a.m. Then a stamp. Return TO source. I stood there in the underground archive, holding the file of a man who'd asked the same questions I was asking, and understood with crystalline clarity what return to source meant. Jason hadn't quit. He hadn't been fired. He'd been reclassified as a returnable item and processed through the very system he'd been trying to understand. Somewhere in this archive, on one of these endless shelves, there was probably an item that had once been Jason Reeves. Transformed, packaged, cataloged. Another impossible return filed away in the dark. You weren't supposed to find this place. I spun around, my phone's light sweeping across the figure who'd spoken. It was Trevor, standing at the entrance to the archive, his usual cheerful expression replaced with something more neutral, more alert. Trevor, what is this place? What's really going on here? He walked toward me slowly, his footsteps making no sound on the earth floor. As he moved, I noticed details I'd overlooked before. His shadow fell in the wrong direction relative to my light. His eyes reflected the phone's beam like an animal's. And when he smiled, it didn't quite reach his eyes, or rather, it reached them too much, stretching his face in ways that were almost but not quite human. This is the real returns department, he said. Everything upstairs is just interface, a way for people to hand over what shouldn't exist without realizing what they're really doing. You process the returns, we archive them here, and eventually they get sorted and sent to their final destinations. Sent where? Depends on the item. Some go to research facilities. Some get neutralized. Some get sent back to wherever they originally came from, places with names you couldn't pronounce and physics you couldn't comprehend. He gestured to the shelves around us. This whole archive is a buffer zone, a temporary holding area for things that exist in the cracks between normal and impossible. And Jason, where did he get sent? Trevor's expression flickered, something that might have been sadness crossing his not quite human face. Jason didn't get sent anywhere. Jason became part of the archive. He insisted on understanding everything, on documenting it all, on finding the source of the impossibility. So the impossibility absorbed him. He's still here, in a way, dispersed throughout the collection. A little bit of Jason in every strange return, every impossible item. He wanted to be connected to the truth, so he became it. My grip tightened on my phone. And you? What are you? I'm a custodian. Have been for much longer than 5 years. Longer than this building has existed. The structure changes, the facade updates, but the purpose remains the same. We clean up what shouldn't be. We maintain the boundary between the world people think they live in and the world that actually exists beneath it. The roots, I said, understanding. Amanda's speaker talked about roots, about a network. Trevor nodded. The roots are one aspect. There are others. The network Amanda encountered is one of the older ones, organic, patient, pre-human. But there are newer networks too. Digital ones, quantum ones, conceptual ones. They all find ways to breach into consensus reality, and they all leave artifacts that need to be processed. That's why places like this exist. Why people like you are necessary. But I don't want this, I said, my voice rising. I didn't sign up to be a filter for impossible things. I just needed a job. Nobody signs up for this knowingly, Trevor said gently. But some people are compatible. You have the right kind of mind, skeptical enough to see the strangeness, but pragmatic enough to keep functioning anyway. Most people would have quit after the first impossible return. You lasted 3 years. That makes you valuable. He took another step closer. You have a choice now, Derek. You can go back upstairs, forget you saw this place, and continue doing your job. Follow the rules. Process the returns. Don't ask questions. You'll be safe that way. You'll stay human. Or you can become like Jason. Dig deeper. Try to understand everything. Map the impossible until it maps you back. That path leads to reclassification. Eventually, you become too contaminated by the knowledge, too entangled with the network, and you transform into something that needs to be archived. I thought about Amanda, about the terror in her eyes when she brought in the speaker. I thought about all the other customers who'd stood at my desk, desperate to be free of items that had infected their lives with impossibility. There's a third option, I said slowly. I could walk out, quit, leave this all behind. Trevor shook his head. You're already contaminated, Derek. You've touched too many impossible things, processed too many breaches. The knowledge has rooted in you. If you leave, you'll just carry it with you, spreading it to wherever you go next. You become a carrier. So I'm trapped. You're necessary, Trevor corrected. The valve needs someone to turn it. The filter needs someone to operate it. This job exists because people like you can stand at the boundary and maintain it. It's not pleasant work, but it prevents something much worse. What could be worse? Uncontrolled breach, Trevor said simply. If this return's desk closes, if the valve isn't maintained, all the impossibility we process here doesn't just go away. It backs up, builds pressure, and eventually explodes outward. Every strange return you've processed in the last 3 years would manifest simultaneously in the real world. Every contaminated item would find its way back to a customer. The speaker with roots would spread to every home. The bouncy castle would materialize at every children's party. The painting would hang in every living room, showing everyone their own impossible reflection. He gestured to the shelves around us. These thousands of items, all the archived impossibilities from decades of operations, they'd all breach at once. The thin ground this store is built on would crack wide open, and everything growing beneath it would surge upward. Ohio would become ground zero for a reality collapse that would spread across the continent. I felt sick, so I have to stay. I have to keep processing returns forever, knowing what I'm really doing, or the world ends. Not forever, Trevor said. Just until we find someone compatible to replace you. Usually takes 5 to 7 years. Then you can transfer to a different position. Inventory management, corporate liaison, containment team. There are lots of options for people who understand the truth. You'd be surprised how many mid-level Costco managers are former returns specialists who've seen too much to go back to normal life. I looked around the archive, at the endless shelves of impossible things, and felt the weight of the choice pressing down on me. Stay and maintain the boundary, or leave and risk catastrophe, or dig deeper like Jason and lose myself entirely. I need time to think, I said finally. Trevor nodded. You have until your shift ends. But Derek, the fact that you found this place tonight isn't an accident. The building showed you. It only reveals itself to people who are ready for the next level of understanding. You were meant to find this. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Rule 47. You've read it. I pulled out my mental catalog of the rules. Rule 47 was the last one in the binder, printed on a separate page in different ink. If you were reading this, you are ready. The choice has already been made. Now you simply have to accept it. I thought that was just corporate mysticism. I said weakly. Nothing in that rule book is mysticism, Trevor replied. It's all been learned through experience, through people like you and Jason and the dozens of others who've stood at that desk before. Each rule exists because someone needed it. Rule 47 exists because eventually, everyone who lasts long enough reaches the point where they stop choosing and start accepting. He walked away into the darkness, his footsteps fading until I was alone in the archive with thousands of impossible things and the weight of an unwanted truth. I stood there for a long time, my phone's battery draining, the light growing dimmer. Around me, the items on the shelves seemed to whisper, not audibly, but in a way I could feel, a pressure against my mind like thousands of voices, all speaking at frequencies just below hearing. They were telling me their stories, where they'd come from, what they'd been, how they'd crossed over from impossible to real. And beneath all their individual narratives, I sensed a larger pattern, a vast intelligence that wasn't any single thing, but the aggregate of all the strangeness, a network of impossibility that had been growing since long before humans existed and would continue long after we were gone. The roots Amanda's speaker had mentioned were just one strand of that network. There were others, digital entities that lived in the space between code and execution, conceptual beings that existed in the gap between idea and manifestation, temporal anomalies that had always existed and never existed simultaneously. And this archive, this impossible sublevel beneath a Costco in Ohio, was one of thousands of collection points around the world, all filtering the impossible back out of reality before it could spread and contaminate everything. We weren't fighting the impossibility. We were managing it, giving it somewhere to go, something to do, a way to exist without destroying the fragile consensus reality that humans needed to survive. I was part of that system now. I've been since my first shift. The moment I processed my first impossible return, I'd been marked, changed, made compatible with the truth. Rule 47 was right. The choice had already been made. My phone's light finally died, plunging me into absolute darkness. But I realized I could still see, not with my eyes exactly, but with some other sense that had been growing in me over 3 years of night shifts. I could perceive the archive around me, the dimensions of the space, the presence of the items on the shelves. I was adapting, becoming more suitable for my role, learning to see the way Trevor saw, to exist in the liminal space between normal and impossible. I made my way back to the stairs, up to the corridor, through the door that sealed silently behind me. When I emerged back into the main floor of the Costco, everything looked exactly the same as it had before. But I wasn't the same. I could see the thin places now, spots where reality was stretched, where something else was pressing through. Aisle 37 existed. I'd just been unable to perceive it before. It was between 35 and 36, occupying a space that was both there and not there, filled with items that existed in quantum superposition until someone impossible enough tried to observe them. The building was larger on the inside, its geometry non-Euclidean in ways that only became apparent if you knew how to look. The parking lot outside had more than 1,313 spaces. It had infinite spaces, extending into dimensions that couldn't be mapped on any conventional plan. And beneath it all, the roots. I could sense them now, vast networks of organic and inorganic matter, spreading through the earth, connecting to other thin places, other archives, other return desks staffed by other people who'd learned to see. I went back to my desk. The Christmas lights I'd been taking to containment were sitting there, sparking their impossible colors. I processed them properly this time, filled out the containment form, and set them aside for the van that would arrive in an hour. The rest of the night passed quietly. A man returned a set of kitchen knives that whispered recipes for things that shouldn't be eaten. A woman brought back a vacuum cleaner that had sucked up something other than dirt and was now heavier than it should be despite appearing empty. A teenager returned a video game that had started showing levels of his actual life, including levels he hadn't lived yet. I processed them all efficiently, following every protocol, flagging the high-risk items, documenting everything. The perfect employee, the ideal filter. When my shift ended at 7 a.m., I logged out and walked to my car. The sunrise painted the sky in colors that were all perfectly normal, perfectly real, perfectly part of consensus reality. But I could see the other colors now too, the ones that existed in the spaces between wavelengths, the hues that most people's brains filtered out before they could even register them. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, though I suspected it wasn't unknown anymore. I suspected I knew exactly who was texting me. Welcome to the team. Your new employee packet will arrive in 3 days. It includes an updated rulebook, access codes for the archive, and a list of other compatible personnel at various locations. You'll find the work is easier once you accept what you are. Congratulations on your promotion to Senior Return Specialist. Trevor. I sat in my car, staring at the message, feeling the weight of the knowledge settling into my bones. I thought about quitting, about running, about trying to go back to a normal life. But Trevor was right. I was contaminated now. The impossible had rooted in me too deeply to be extracted. And somewhere beneath the Costco, in an archive that shouldn't exist, Jason Reeves was dispersed across 1,000 impossible items. His consciousness fragmented and filed away, a warning of what happened to people who dug too deep. I had 2 choices: accept my role and maintain the boundary, or resist and eventually be reclassified, transformed into another item for the archive, another cautionary tale for whoever took my place. Rule 47. The choice has already been made. Now you simply have to accept it. I started my car and drove home. I would sleep for a few hours, then wake up and prepare for my next shift. I would continue processing returns, maintaining the valve, filtering the impossible back out of reality. I would follow the rules, avoid asking too many questions, and try not to think about what was growing beneath the foundations. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was chaos, collapse, the end of the comfortable illusion that most people lived in. And if my complicity, my acceptance, my willingness to stand at the boundary was all that prevented that collapse, then I would stand there. Not because I wanted to, but because someone had to. And I was compatible. Epilogue. 6 months later, I was training my first assistant. Her name was Rachel Voss, and she had that same quality I must have had when I started. Skeptical, but pragmatic. Uncomfortable with strangeness, but too professional to let it show. She'd been working day shifts at the front registers for 2 years before applying for the night position. So most nights are quiet. I told her, showing her how to log into the return system. You'll process maybe 10 to 15 returns during an 8-hour shift. The system is pretty intuitive. Scan the receipt, scan the item, process the refund. Simple. But Rachel asked, because she could tell there was more. But sometimes you'll get returns that are unusual. Items that don't quite make sense. Customers who seem off. Situations that don't add up. When that happens, you follow the rules exactly. Don't improvise. Don't try to logic your way through it. Just follow the protocol. I handed her the red binder. She flipped through it, her eyebrows rising as she read some of the more unusual rules. Is this serious? She asked, pointing to Rule 23 about warm items. Or is this some kind of hazing thing? I looked at her carefully, measuring her reaction. The rules exist because someone before you needed them. Follow them exactly, and you'll be fine. It was the same thing my supervisor had told me 3 years ago. The same warning that it seemed like a joke until it wasn't. Rachel's first impossible return came on her 3rd solo shift. A man brought in a toaster that was toasting bread that hadn't been put into it yet. Slices appearing in the slots already browned, still warm, with no physical bread inserted. She called me in a panic, and I walked her through the protocol, watched her process the return, saw the exact moment when her worldview cracked just slightly. She'd be fine, or she wouldn't. Either way, the valve needed operators, and she was compatible enough to last at least a few months, maybe longer. I was senior returns specialist now, which meant I spent half my time training new people and the other half processing the truly dangerous returns. The items too contaminated for beginners to handle, the customers who weren't quite customers anymore, the breaches that required careful management. I had access to the archive now. I went down there sometimes during my breaks, walking the endless shelves, feeling the presence of all the impossible things we'd collected over the decades. I never stayed long. There was something about the archive that pulled at you if you lingered, like the routes Amanda's speaker had described, trying to establish connections, to spread into new territory. I'd seen Jason once, or something that had been Jason. It was filed in section Q7, shelf 14, a mirror that showed reflections of people who'd worked at the store. When I looked into it, I saw myself at the returns desk, but standing behind me in the reflection was Jason, his hand on my shoulder, his expression knowing and sad. The reflection moved independently of me. Jason's lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but understood anyway. You're doing well. Better than I did. Keep following the rules. Then he faded back into the mirror's surface. Just another archived impossibility among thousands. I didn't go back to that shelf again. The network beneath the store continued to grow. I could feel it sometimes. Late in my shifts, a vast presence pushing up from below like roots seeking sunlight. But the returns desk acted as a pressure valve, releasing enough impossibility to prevent catastrophic breach while maintaining enough boundary to keep reality stable. It was exhausting work. It changed you in ways that couldn't be undone, but it was necessary. And sometimes, very rarely, it was rewarding. Like when Amanda came back 6 months after her speaker return. She looked healthier, more rested, and she brought me a card thanking me for helping her when she'd been desperate. She didn't mention the speaker or the roots or any of it. I suspected her mind had quietly filed those memories under bad dream or stress-induced hallucination, the way most people's minds did with impossible things. She was back to living in consensus reality, protected by her brain's filters from the truth of what had almost consumed her home. That was the point of her work, I realized. Not to fight the impossibility, but to filter it in manageable doses so that most people never had to know how thin the membrane between normal and impossible really was. My phone buzzed. A text from Trevor. Unusual return incoming. Customer en route with multiple high-risk items. Full containment protocol. Thought you'd want to handle this one personally. I stood up, pulled out the updated rulebook from my desk, now expanded to 63 rules based on new incidents of protocols, and prepared myself. Rachel was at the other return station, processing a normal exchange of printer paper. She didn't even look up, already learning to differentiate between routine transactions and the other kind. She'd learn, or she wouldn't. Either way, the desk would be staffed, the valve would be maintained, and reality would continue its precarious existence on thin ground, held together by protocols and pragmatic acceptance of the impossible. The automatic doors whispered open. A figure approached through the dimmed lights of the night shift Costco, pushing a cart piled high with items I couldn't quite make out from this distance. I logged into the system, pulled up the containment protocols, and waited. This was my job now. This was my life. Standing at the boundary between the world people believed in and the world that actually existed, processing returns of things that shouldn't be, maintaining the fragile barrier that kept chaos at bay. I didn't choose this path, but Rule 47 was right. The choice had already been made. I'd made it the moment I answered that job posting 3 years ago, the moment I processed my first impossible return and chose to come back for the next shift instead of running. Now I simply accepted it. The customer reached my desk, and I looked up to see what impossible thing they brought me this time. "Good evening," I said, pulling on my professional smile. "How can I help you with your return tonight?" And in the red glow of the return sign, with thousands of impossible things archived beneath my feet and an endless stream of impossibilities yet to come, I did my job. Because someone had to, and I was compatible. The end.